Hello and welcome to Mary Live. This is Dr. Mark Miravalle. My friends, we're hearing much in the Catholic and even secular media about synodality, synods, an upcoming synod on synodality, which will happen in 2023. And essentially, this is the process of the Church trying to listen to the people. And Pope Francis has outlined a several-year approach, which will be climactic in 2023, to address the concerns of the faithful, even those who would not consider themselves faithful. Everyone can enter this process of synodal dialogue and discussion with the intention of a better church at the end. Now, let me mention first and foremost, there's nothing wrong with synodality in and of itself. Listening to the faithful and even to the world itself within its proper limits can be a very effective way of self-examination for the church, of improvement. These can be very positive things. We all have blind spots. So does the church in action. So there could be something theoretically very beneficial to this process. At the same time, what we've been hearing, and again, just so you're familiar with the process on the local diocesan level, and many of you have participated in this already, you were called to submit responses to questions. And I should say from the beginning here, many of the questions themselves did not greatly lend to a full personal, spiritual, kind of fullness approach to the situation of the church, because it was somewhat limited by, in some cases, not in all, but in some cases, by the questions themselves. The questions tended to be very practical, very concrete. What changes would you like to see made, and what concrete problems do you see? All fine and well in themselves, but the process can then almost taint itself so that we're only offering concrete, pragmatic changes for the state of the church today. And again, that process happened for many people throughout the world. In some places, it's still happening, where at the local diocesan level, they're gathering information, feedback from the people, and then that will be submitted to Rome. That will be sorted and prioritized, which in itself is an interesting question. Prioritized by whom and based on what presuppositions, but that's obviously a necessary part of the process. The synod of bishops can examine every comment from every Catholic who has an opinion, and even, again, this has encouraged comments from non-Catholics. So that process then will lead up to some statements and some conclusions by the bishops submitting to the Holy Father, and then ultimately the Holy Father will have the final say on what becomes concrete changes based on this. My concern is this, my friends. We're hearing headlines of other synods, other processes, on what people are reporting they want changed. And so what are some of the common headlines, especially from the West? Married priesthood, women priesthood, same-sex marriage, more openness to LGBTQ, etc. Communities. And so many of what is being published as suggestions from the faithful are not only very concrete, pragmatic, horizontal, that is to say, something we can change ourselves with, but also very external, presupposing that one has, if it's a truly good change, the ability to incorporate this change. Some, of course, in the list I just gave you, could never happen anyway, like women priesthood. So what seems to be taking place in many dioceses throughout the world is a process which has become fundamentally horizontal and external. And by horizontal, I mean we to each other. It's almost becoming a type of ecclesiastical self-help program where And again, that doesn't take away the positive suggestions and the positive input, which can be very helpful, but as a solution, we want to change church disciplines, and in some places, sadly, they want to change church doctrine. So if I change this out here for them, that is, other members of the church, in an external, concrete, pragmatic, structural way, well, that's the remedy. That's what's going to save the church. I would fundamentally, respectfully disagree that that's going to be the remedy for what is a spiritual crisis in the church. So let's get back to the most fundamentals of this issue. The church is in crisis. The church is not just in a type of structural crisis. The church is in a spiritual crisis. People leaving the Catholic Church in droves. And while it's potentially positive to have input even from those who have left the church, surely that can be helpful. The idea that those who are no longer in the church would have a formidable role in establishing, quote, new doctrine, which can't happen anyway, seems to be a tragic mishap, a synodal misdirection that will in no sense help the church. So what would be a positive synodal contribution? And again, I don't mean to pontificate on what exactly the church needs to do right now, but I can say what the church will not be benefited from, and that is by a changing in church doctrine, especially many of these doctrines, which could not change anyway. They can develop into a greater understanding, but they can't essentially change. The church's teaching on the intrinsic evil of the homosexual act is not going to change. The church's teaching on priesthood as something available only for men is not going to change. John Paul II almost made a solemn definition about that, just a notch below that. Okay, so that's not going to help. So what would help then? What should this synodal process be fundamentally focused on? Well, instead of the horizontal and the external, changing this discipline or the sad effort to change that doctrine, if we're going to remedy a spiritual crisis, it has to be a spiritual remedy. And I don't want to be patronizing or presumptuous in saying what should be plainly obvious. Even if you had a perfect structural change, a whole new pastoral plan, if you don't have the grace to incorporate it, if you don't have the love of neighbor, which allows us to avoid things like abuse in all of its forms, and even more subtle elements of discrimination in the church and beyond, etc., the structure is not going to affect spiritual renewal. What will? What will? Remedies that are, number one, spiritual, and number two, internal. Now, I'm not saying it stops there. I'm not saying we can only talk about spiritual ideas and remedies which will lead to personal conversion. I'm not saying it stops there. I'm saying it has to start there. Because until there's conversion of heart through the grace of God in Christ in the church, we're not going to be able to live a life of gospel charity to one another, let alone a full renewal of the church. So I want to offer two elements that should be at the top of the list for any authentic synodal dialogue that really seeks a spiritual renewal, a spiritual revival, a spiritual remedy for a spiritual crisis, which does have practical applications. Number one, to have an authentic renewal of the church, we must become more Eucharistic. Now, I can hear some saying, or at least by extension, some commenting, yeah, but we need real change. My friends, that is real change. That's what allows for real change. The power of Jesus in the Eucharist can change everything in the Eucharist because he's king of the universe. He can change the world, the church, the planetary bodies. He can change hearts. But because he has granted us freedom, we have to choose the Eucharist. The Eucharist, and this is a beautiful document written by Annalea Apostle. I encourage you to take a look at this. You can go to directionforourtimes.com, where she talks about, as part of remedy to the situation of the church now, we have to see the church as kind of this institution that embodies, protects, and promulgates the Eucharist. Why? Because Jesus is the answer to everything, and his Eucharistic presence is an exponential spiritual force of grace and love. Remember, he's a person, not just a force. This is not Star Wars. This is Jesus Christ, the true King of the universe. He can affect every single conversion of heart, which then manifests in a greater love of neighbor, the stopping of things like human trafficking, of discrimination, of lack of charity for those who are poor, who are marginalized. You see, my friends, if we start with the second, if we start with the practical and pragmatic, we can come up with a wonderful laundry list of synodal changes. We just won't be able to live them. That's why, first and foremost, by our bishops, by our leaders, the first call of an authentic synod on synodality, which listens to the voice of the people, God willing, we the people are saying this to our leaders so they can be underscored and supported in this. We need a Eucharistic revival in the church. Now, that has to have practical teeth. I get that, and it can. I commend the U.S. bishops who, in a recent meeting, have called for a Eucharistic revival in the Catholic Church in the United States. For example, what? For example, much more Eucharistic adoration. Encouraging adoration at every parish. Having bishops lead a monthly Eucharistic adoration in the largest building in their diocese, the largest church, of course, or thing appropriate for adoration, so the people can see that they put their money where their mouth is. They're leading by example, by a joyful witness. Our bishops and priests are leading the adoration. They're there for it. They're the backbone. There's the supporting, they're the sustenance, they're the fire, they're the flame of an authentic renewal of the Eucharist. My friends, can you imagine what kind of transformation would happen if every parish were to start offering some form of Eucharistic adoration? It would be mind-blowing. More than that, it would be heart-blowing. It would be so transformative if, instead of seeing the Eucharist as a nice devotional thing, which we do at the beginning of a synod, at the end of a synodal gathering, but in between, we got to, roll up our sleeves and do the real work. The Eucharist is the real work, my friends. That's what I'm saying. That's my message to you. The Eucharist is the real work. The Eucharist is the real remedy. Give Jesus, the all-powerful Jesus, a chance instead of our own ecclesiastical self-help, our own solutions based on our own committee, based on our own administrations, based on our own, practical changes. It simply will be void unless our Eucharistic Jesus is first. So number one, on every synodal response, not exclusive, but primary, first, should be a Eucharistic revival. More adoration, encouragement for daily Mass, of course, Sunday Mass, preaching on the beauty of the liturgy. How often have we heard, when was the last time you heard a moving homily on the sacrifice of the Mass? Or spending time with Jesus each day, or what Fulton Sheen used to call the one great remedy for priests, a holy hour. If you can't do a holy hour, do a holy half an hour. But get your being before his being in the Eucharist. That should be number one for an authentic spiritual remedy to a authentic, some might even say unprecedented spiritual crisis that's being experienced in the church and the world today. Not just as a nice devotional opening and close, but as the first remedy. Let's give it to Christ. It's his church after all, we have to remember. It's not ours, it's his. So let's put our first priority of authentic Catholic renewal, a new emphasis in every conceivable way, at every level of church life, on the Eucharist. Mass, worthy reception, adoration, as much as we can. Number 2, we have to Marianize the church. Again, some might be saying, well, there he goes again. These are nice platitudes, but they don't do anything. I beg to differ, my friends. Look at history. How many times has Our Lady interceded to save the church at critical moments, to save countries, to save nations from major disaster, from takeover, from Muslim Turks and even elements of communism? Our Lady, after Jesus in the Eucharist, is the most powerful means of the distribution of graces, which is what we need for an authentic church renewal. Now, St. Maximilian Kolbe used to use the expression to Marianize the church. What does that mean? It means we seriously ask the question, and again, I say this with total respect. Holy bishops, bishops of the church, please take this to heart. Please don't take this as, well, we'll end our synod or our synodal gathering with a nice procession and we'll, crown a statue of Our Lady in the back corner. No, put her in the front. Put her as number 2 after our Eucharistic Jesus as the remedy. Call our faithful, you are bishops, by example, call the faithful to return to a generous love of the mother, where we can ask the question, not only what would Jesus do in this situation, but what would Mary do? Now, why would we have to say what would Mary do if we've already said what would Jesus do? Because Mary was human. And sometimes we have this thing, yeah, Jesus would do this, but after all, he's Jesus, he's divine. I'm not Jesus. Don't put me on a divine level. You can't do that with Mary. Our Blessed Mother was entirely human. She was immaculate, full of grace, but she was entirely human. And so to have a new entry of the maternal and the feminine in the church, and by feminine I mean especially, as St. Edith Stein said, a new focus on the person. Don't just look at the institution. Don't just look at the big picture. Women and mothers are great at looking at persons, individual kids, what their needs are. Well, we need more women in the church in this regard to help the men not just look at the big picture, but to look at the little people, individual persons. And how will that affect them if we implement this policy? Not just big picture administrative changes, but policies based on the understanding that every child is the image of God, and women in general have a better capacity to understand that because of the maternity that is intrinsic in their femininity as women. Well, ultimately, that has to be raised to the level of our Blessed Mother. We have to ask, what would Mary do in this situation? Would Mary steamroll? Or would Mary take a little bit more time to make sure that none of her children were ill-affected by this new process, by this new implementation? And of course, that means also we need to hear from our bishops, you got to be praying the rosary. These beads can do it. I find it fascinating, with a recent article talking about the rosary as weaponizing. I thought it was really very amusing that the secular community is afraid of a handful of beads. They're afraid of this militarizing rosary. Well, in another sense, they're right. They're right because the rosary is the great spiritual weapon against many secular agenda that offend God and that break down family and that are contrary to faith. Again, I don't mean just lighting a candle to Our Lady in the corner. I mean putting her as number 2 in our hierarchy of what we're going to do about the spiritual crisis. We're going to become more Marian as a church. We're going to pray the rosary. Our bishops are going to lead us in praying the rosary. How beautiful. Our bishops are going to explain to us what Marian consecration is and why we should do it, and lead us in joy and example about becoming more Marian as a church. Because as St. John Paul II said so beautifully, and Pope Benedict after him, the church is first of all Marian even before it's Petrine. What does that mean? It means even before the role of Peter and the office of the Pope is instituted, first is the role of Mary, the disciple who says yes and becomes the mother of God and the mother of all peoples. So to Marianize the church, to emphasize Our Lady, to have Our Lady as part of every homily, even if it's just closing. This was very standard in the homilies and treatments of John Paul II, his encyclicals. It always ended with something on Our Lady. And oftentimes had something about her in the beginning, middle, and end anyway. But let's see this as not just Our Lady of the statue, but as a powerful queen and mother who's been given the task by Jesus to mediate grace and to advocate. Who better to take care of the body of Jesus than the woman who gave us the body of Jesus? That would be Mary. So along with other legitimate practical elements, remember, we're the Catholic Church. We're not the either or. We're not the sola scriptura. We're not the sola fide. It's faith and works. It's scripture and tradition. It's faith and works in terms of how we do things as a church. So it is to prioritize the spiritual, the Eucharist and the Mother, and then let that lead how we deal with other issues in the church, which do need addressing. But my friends, I'm going to end with, as I began, if we focus only on the pragmatic, if we think changing rules for priests rather than calling for the conversion of priests, or changing disciplines for the faithful instead of calling for the conversion of the faithful, is going to solve the remedy, I'm afraid we are painfully naive, and we will have a process that could bear true fruit to be essentially a misdirection, a synodal misdirection. So one might say, well, I already sent my thing into the synod. Remember the steps, my friends. There's several steps to this. You sent your thing into the bishop. Then your local diocese, it could be your vicar general, someone assigned to your diocese. Then they prioritize. And then it goes to Rome. And then in 2023, there'll be a synod. There's still plenty of time for you to voice to your bishops, to your priests, to make sure that the Eucharist and Our Lady are at the top of the list in terms of authentic reform. And again, those can take different ramifications. I personally believe that until Our Lady is solemnly defined as the spiritual mother of all peoples, which would be the ultimate way of telling the world we do want to Marianize the church because we want Our Lady bringing graces to the people of God that only she can give us because Jesus has given her this task as mediatrix of all graces. And we want to acknowledge it because when we acknowledge it, we get more grace. In any and many manifestations, put the Eucharist first in the synod for synodality, put our Blessed Mother second, and have it come from the voice of our leaders, that they truly believe that these two pillars, the Eucharist and Our Lady, can be the ultimate forms, both in terms of substantial grace and in terms of guidance of other practical implementations that will lead to an authentic renewal of the church. Because I can tell you this, my friends, unless Jesus is adored in the Eucharist, and unless Our Lady is recognized, we will not have a triumph of the Immaculate Heart, and we will not have a church renewal. So let's get our priorities right. Let's give a spiritual remedy for a spiritual crisis, and then let the wonderful practical implementations be authentic and be founded, be sustained, be empowered by the grace that can only come from above. Thanks for being with us with Mary Live. This is Mark Miravalle. God bless you all.